Well, thanks very much for having me here. It feels just like teaching at Dal because you're all sitting multiple rows away from me, and I'm good with that if you're comfortable with that. I also need to apologize that I have not come with any fancy PowerPoint to entertain you. It's sort of just me. But the good news is I wave my hands a lot for visual stimulation for you, and so if you're someone who learns that way, hopefully that'll entertain you enough. I'll try to be entertaining at the front. First, I wanted to thank the organizers of the Critical Conversation series and, of course, the law school for the invitation to be here, in particular Karen and Kira Ladner. It's really actually fantastic to be at the University of Manitoba because it offers such incredible leadership and has such a strong commitment to work related to the TRC and more broadly to reconciliation. And in particular, its commitment to the strategic priorities of human rights and Aboriginal achievement in education is quite remarkable, and something that I will go home and brag about at my home university and see if they can feel that competitive spirit to think about orienting themselves to such important goals in an orienting way for a university. The role the university has played in supporting the work of the TRC is nothing short of remarkable, and I think it's not noted enough the extent to which that kind of a relationship is quietly in the background supporting the work of the TRC in important ways, including through the Prairie Perspectives Conference that was a part of the first national event here in Winnipeg that the Centre for Human Rights and Research Planning was involved in, and the work of Resolve in supporting the statement-taking activities, the exciting bid for the Research Centre that I understand from the newspaper is underway here and have been hearing some about, and not to mention all of the incredible scholars that you have here engaged and working actively in these issues. My big regret, I have to tell you, is that I'm located so far away that I can't be part of the sort of full and rich conversation that's already happened and is yet to come in the Critical Conversation series. I looked with envy at the list of seminar and speakers that you've already had, and struck by the incredible depth of the scholarship that's right in your midst that are participating in the seminar series and that you've managed to attract to come. Marginally confused about why you would include me in that midst, but happy about that. And I was so excited to have been given the chance to be a part of it that I actually, seriously, without reservation, agreed to come to Winnipeg in January. And I got, I have to say, lots, contrary to the warnings I received, your weather's actually not too bad, so you've taken away all of my jokes about freezing cold weather. And in fact, I've just left 2 hours before the massive storm hit in Halifax, which has canceled all of our schools, and it is now a cold and messy place to be, and this appears to be the delightful place to be in the country today. But it's also been extremely warm in terms of the reception I've received from the people. So in preparing to come here, I had several colleagues and friends who I had no idea were from Winnipeg, show up at my door unprompted to tell me all about how fantastic Winnipeg and Manitoba were. And they gave me tour books, and they lent me warmer jackets because apparently I was ill-equipped. And I think they were hoping I wouldn't notice the cold. And they gave me a book to read on Riel on the plane, which I didn't get to do because I was working on other stuff, but hopefully that'll be my homeward-bound activity. I felt I could hardly break it to them that I'm here for less than 48 hours. So I just took everything and said, thanks, that's great, and thought there's no way any of this is going to get used. So far, actually, the jacket's been fairly helpful, although it's almost causing me to sweat because it's so warm here now. And I flipped through the tour book, just out of interest in preparation for my visit, and found it actually fairly informative. So from the tour book, I learned that, in the words of its author, I take no credit or blame for what I learned from the tour book, maybe for poor research, but that Manitoba defies categorization. It is neither, so the tour book tells me, east nor west. I have to tell you, this was a shock to me. But I am from Halifax, and most things are west, so I thought it was west. But okay, so it's very central. I looked at a map. This is, in fact, true. It's neither urban nor rural, and according to the book, it's not even a real prairie province. It is equal parts forest, lakes, mountain, flooding rivers. And finally, the author provided these words of advice, or maybe warning. If you want to see much of Manitoba, you're going to need a car. And you're also going to need an energetic set of limbs, a sharp pair of eyes, and an adventurous palate. For as flat as the land may seem, this is no place for the sedentary or the soft. So this seemed to me, actually, as I sat on my couch in the midst of contemplating my visit and this talk in particular, as fairly sage advice. And not only germane to my very short visit and the subsequent one I've now promised to have to see all of the stuff the tour book told me I should see, but to the task at hand, which is considering, or as the title of the talk put it more ambitiously, reconciling the work of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, I'm not sure we're going to need a car to get around the issues, but certainly, despite what impressions one might have of the work of the Commission as straightforward or fairly flat, looking at either its name or more closely at its mandate, it's certainly true that it's no place for the sedentary or the soft, and that we will be well served by energy and a sharp eye. And I'm sure this is something that this series of critical conversations has already shown you. My brief encounter with the tourist guide also made me think anew about Manitoba as a fitting location for the Commission. For just as Manitoba defies simple categorization, so too does the Commission and its mandate. This is true with respect to the work of the Commission broadly, but more specifically, and what I want to talk to you about today, to understanding and connecting the paired goals of truth and reconciliation, for which the Commission is named. And it's also true in thinking about the nature of the Commission's mandate, what it's meant to do, and the implications that might have for the way in which it should approach its work. Both of these issues require a nuanced approach that can help us understand the complexity of the Commission's role and its tasks, and yet offers a supportive conceptual framework that helps us guide that work. So today I want to think with you a little bit about whether relational theory provides a framework for us for these purposes. And I want to tell you that I think from this starting point we can better understand both the substance, the goals of the work of the TRC, and also the nature of its mandate, what the nature of the task is that has been set before it. So first, to consider the substance of the TRC's mandate. As reflected in its name, of course, it's concerned with both truth and reconciliation. And this particular scope of the Commission's mandate reflects its role in the settlement agreement that was aimed at achieving a holistic and comprehensive response to the abuses and legacies of residential schools. It was meant to be the vehicle through which the voices of those involved or affected by the residential school system could be heard. And it's broadly intended to be focused on all of the harms related to or flowing from the residential school system, and is mandated to construct a comprehensive picture, or if you like, an official historical record of the residential school system and its legacies. This focus of the Commission is intended to provide the context that was seen as necessary to give meaning and legitimacy to the common experience payments, to the independent assessment process, and the other parts of the settlement. So from this picture of the past that the Commission is charged with generating, it's then intended to recommend ways through to a future marked by new and reconciled relationships within Aboriginal communities themselves and between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. So it's this latter goal that is perhaps represents the Commission's most significant role in terms of the settlement and the settlement agreement. The primary aim of the settlement is to deal with the past abuses and their legacies in a way that forges a brighter future founded on new relationships embedded in mutual recognition and respect, or so described by Indian Residential Schools Canada. The burden of realizing this goal within the settlement largely rests on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as its name might suggest to you. Figuring out how it is that the Commission is to do this requires an understanding of both truth and reconciliation and how we get from one to the other, or what the relationship is between the two. In an earlier piece that I wrote for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation on a series that they've done, a great series if you haven't seen it, of books on reconciliation and contemplating some of the meaning of that. In that piece, I suggested that restorative justice might actually provide us a missing bridge for the Commission that they might need if they're going to try to travel this road from truth, at least toward reconciliation. And in that article, I actually elaborate the importance or potential of restorative justice, both at a conceptual level and at a practical operational level, in terms of providing some cues for how it might approach its work. Today, I want to look at that a little bit, but I want to focus, for our purposes today, mostly on the conceptual side of that, on the framework that restorative justice might provide in understanding or connecting the aims of truth and reconciliation, and then in moving forward to have us think a little bit about the implications of that for the nature of its work and mandate. So I think restorative justice is well suited to do this, at least on my account. So there's lots of versions of restorative justice, there's lots of descriptions of it. Some people think it's just a process, some people think it's otherwise. I approach it and I use it in this way as a theory of justice and as a relational theory of justice. So its significance here lies in its connection to relational theory for our purposes. In response to a wrong, restorative justice sees justice as concerned with the harms that happen to people in relationship. Restorative justice, justice on its account, requires the restoration of relationships that are harmed. So starting from a relational view of the world, restorative justice recognizes the fundamental interconnectedness of people. Right? That as a matter of who we are connected to one another. We live in and through relationships with one another, in webs, if you like, of social relationship. And when a wrong is perpetrated or a state of wrong persists, the harm resulting from it extends through these webs of relationships to affect not only the victims or survivors, the wrongdoers, their immediate families, their supporters, their communities, their culture, future generations, the broader society of which they are a part. So doing justice in a restorative way requires attending to the full range of these relational harms that are related to wrongs. On a relational understanding of justice, the harms that result from wrong are most significantly harms to relationships. Now, that doesn't mean we don't care about the harms to individual people, but it means that we must identify and understand and address those harms in terms of how they are affecting and impacting the relationships in and through which we live. So understanding the relational nature of these harms, I think, helps us to more fully capture, identify, and understand the harms that individuals have suffered. Restorative justice resonates and, of course, owes a lot, right, to the insights of Aboriginal conceptions of justice. Right? So depending on the theory and the version, there is more or less resonance, but there certainly is, at its core, a common starting point in terms of a relational view of the world, the significance and importance of starting from that set of assumptions. For its part, the theory of restorative justice I'm offering you here is rooted in an account of a relational view of the self, right, of human beings as inherently relational, connected to others, right, from which flows a relational understanding of the world. So the aim of justice envisioned restoratively is to restore relationships between and among the parties involved. And what we mean by that is to create relationships in which all parties are treated with equal concern, respect, and dignity. That's the character of restored relationships. The aim of justice then envisioned restoratively is about the quality of relationships, right, that represent this basic element of human relationship that reflect our equal moral worth. Those elements of relationship are the building blocks of peaceful and productive human relationships. They're what we need by our nature to be well and to flourish. The goal of restorative justice is then not a return to some past state, as many are led to believe by the term restore. It's more colloquial use. But rather, it's the creation of a future founded on relationships of equal concern, respect, and dignity. But it's a future that's accessible to us and possible for us to imagine because it's rooted in who we are and what we need as human selves. So the aim of restorative justice then is to realize this ideal of human relationship, the elements of relationship that are fundamental to peaceful coexistence and human flourishing. Some might also, or do, misunderstand the focus on relationships and assume that the aim of restorative justice is the restoration of personal or intimate relationships. Such restoration is, of course, not precluded by the idea of restorative justice, but it's not at its core its goal. Restorative justice is concerned with ensuring equality in terms of respect, equal concern, and dignity in social relationships, not in intimate ones between individuals. And by social relationships, I mean those that result from the fact that we all exist in networks of relationships. Relationship is not a choice. We're not in or out of relationship. We just have different kinds of relationships with one another on this account. Right? Some of these relationships might be personal and intimate, but the great majority of them result from the fact that we share the same physical space or political space. So restorative justice is not then, as some accounts suggest, a sort of a Hallmark greeting card version of justice. It's not about the hug and make-up version of justice. Rather, it strives to create the conditions of social relationship in which parties might achieve meaningful, just, and peaceful coexistence. The idea of restored relationships, then, that animates restorative justice might help us in gaining a better understanding of the reconciliation at which the Canadian TRC is aimed. It's not reconciliation in the thick sense. It's not the stuff of greeting cards or intimate reunions for which the TRC ought to strive. Right? As surely this would be both inappropriate and impossible to achieve in many circumstances. Nor is it reconciliation, as one might imagine from, again, another complicated word, that seeks a return to some fleeting prior time when we had better relationships. And even if we could tell, we could find some Canadian heritage moment that might represent that. Rather, the reconciliation that the TRC should seek should be understood relationally, as about trying to construct and live in restored relationships. Reconciliation then seeks a peaceful, productive, and just future in which Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples live together in relationships marked by respect, dignity, and mutual concern for one another. This understanding of reconciliation accords with the conviction expressed in the TRC mandate that reconciliation is an ongoing process. If reconciliation is about restoring relationships, it's more akin to a process than to an endpoint or an end state that is to be achieved or accomplished. Relationships are by their nature dynamic, ever-changing. They require constant attention and adjustment in order to ensure that they continue to reflect the values and qualities of equal respect, concern, and dignity. And establishing such relationships and then maintaining them will take ongoing commitment, time, effort, and the building of our capacities for living in these kinds of relationships with one another. I think understanding this makes clearer the contributions that a finite process like the TRC can make to reconciliation. The Commission will be able to lay, or may be able to lay, the necessary foundation for such relationships. In part by discovering the truth of past wrongs, their implications for our relationships, and what will be required to address to address the related and resulting harms, and equip parties to live together differently in the future. Understanding the goal of reconciliation through this relational theory lens also helps clarify, I think, the relationship between truth and reconciliation, and how to bridge the gap between them. If reconciliation as restored relationships is the animating goal, then the role and the nature of the truth that should be sought by the Commission becomes clearer. So if you look at the Commission's mandate, at least from the text of it, it's actually focused largely on truth, or at least that's the thing it's clearest about, right? Finding truth, writing reports, right? Establishing a history. But the absence of clarity about the meaning of the goal of reconciliation has actually made it difficult to understand the motivation and the parameters for this search for truth. From an understanding of reconciliation as restored relationships, one can work back and ask what role truth plays in this goal and what truth is required. And again, I think we can look to restorative justice, at least to its theory and some of its practices, for guidance. Restorative justice places significant weight on truth-telling as well, as a necessary step towards restored relationships. It requires all parties to participate voluntarily, and that's in the hopes that they will be open to the process and willing to be truthful, to trust it, to be open. The process is predicated upon parties telling their truths about the nature and extent of the harms that they've suffered, their needs with respect to redress and recovery, the role and responsibility they have for what occurred, and about their capacity to assist in repairing and addressing the harms and participating in restored relationships in the future. It's also through the sharing of their truths that parties come to know and understand each other's experiences, their perspectives, and their needs. And this kind of understanding is crucial to reconciliation. So while truth is important to restorative justice, and so far we think that may also mean it's important for reconciliation, the search for the truth may actually impede restoration of relationships. Differing perspectives and experiences make the idea of one single identifiable truth on any matter problematic. Further, the search for the determination of the truth presents one with a series of either-or choices that are more likely to be fractious than relationship building. Maybe like the attempt to characterize Manitoba as prairie or not, Western or Eastern. Reconciliation requires a truth that's able to contain all the complexities born of our interconnectedness, our interdependence. It needs a relational truth. Now, I want to be clear, this is not to be confused with all truth is relative. Relational truth is truth with all of its nuances and complexities. So the legal system is probably our most familiar arbiter of truth, particularly in this building, and it's called upon all the time to make determinations with respect to guilt, culpability, liability, and in that context, it must often strip away the complexity of truth and make a judgment about what part of truth matters to resolving a conflict or controversy for its purposes. But the task of the TRC is not as limited as the task of a court. Its orienting goal is reconciliation, and as such, it can't afford to strip away or ignore the messiness or complexity of truth. So finding relational truth and really requires the creation of opportunities, of spaces, and of processes in which truths can be told and heard, and in which perspectives can meet one another head on to challenge, integrate, and illuminate the truth of what happened, why it happened, and what are its implications for us. In this work of the Commission lies perhaps its greatest opportunity to contribute to reconciliation. By modeling the processes and relationships it actually hopes to see in the future. The Commission then stands to make a significant contribution to reconciliation by serving as an opportunity for those involved to come together in a process that reflects and models the values of reconciled relationships. And I think this implication actually I think this insight actually has implications for the ways in which the Commission's mandate and work should be understood, should be approached, and should be measured. But the approach it suggests runs counter, I think, to some of our instincts and the prevailing approaches that have been influenced by the origins of the Commission. So this brings us then to the other way in which I think the mandate of the Commission defies simple categorization. The Canadian TRC is unique internationally in terms of its origins. It was negotiated. That doesn't make it unusual. Okay? It's actually very typical for such institutions to have political compromise at their core, and this one's no different in that respect. But the context for those negotiations was different. It was not a political transition, as much as we might have wished that was true, but litigation, individual and class action. The TRC is part of and grows out of a legal settlement, sanctioned and thus ordered by the courts. And I think it's important to actually give some attention to how this fact may be shaping the expectations and the approach to the work and the mandate of the TRC. The Commission's mandate is outlined in an appendix to the settlement agreement that all the parties signed. And as a court settlement, indeed, as Canada's largest class action settlement to date, at least last time I checked, not a tort lawyer, the court also had to sign off on, essentially, the settlement, and thus became the ultimate overseer of the agreement. There is an all-party committee who's comprised of representatives by the party who are retained on an ongoing basis to provide oversight, but ultimately, should the agreement be breached, or there's a failure of a party to comply with it, the courts are who we look to for enforcement. This fact of the settlement, that it's part of a legal settlement, structures some of the assumptions about the work, the nature of the work and mandate of the Commission. It's led some to approach the mandate of the Commission in more formal and legalistic ways, or to feel bound by that mandate in more formal and legalistic ways, focusing on the deliverables to be produced by the Commission as required by the agreement. It's led thus to a focus and an emphasis on what the Commission must produce: an official historical record, interim and final reports, national events, community events, commemoration, a research center. The focus on production has even seeped into discussions of research and knowledge, right? And perhaps most troubling, into the expectation that it will produce truth and reconciliation. This approach is revealed as particularly problematic, I think, if one understands truth and reconciliation from a relational perspective that I was speaking about earlier. Such a perspective resists, right, the truth or fixed truth. It reforms our thinking of reconciliation from an attainable moment or a deliverable end state to a dynamic process of relationships characterized by mutual respect, concern, and dignity. The Commission has, rightly by times, resisted the expectation that it will produce reconciliation. And they've done so invoking a similar kind of approach to that taken by the South African Commission, who also struggled with this expectation given its name, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The South African Commission, as the Canadian one did, positions itself as one step along the road to reconciliation. And in doing so, the Canadian Commission made clear that they do not have the time or the resources to reach the end of this road. To its credit, the agreement also seems to recognize this reality, as it describes reconciliation as an ongoing process, although interestingly is then followed by a sentence that describes between and among whom such reconciliation will be achieved. Surely the Commission is right, then, that it would be unreasonable to expect them to produce reconciliation by the end of its 5, possibly 6, maybe 7, depending on how we go, mandate. But it's not just a matter of unreasonable expectations or unrealistic timelines. The real problem with this expectation that the Commission might produce reconciliation is, I think, a reflection of a broader problem with approaching the Commission's mandate through the logic and assumptions of legal settlements and agreements. It invites one to assess success and impact by deliverables and/or their production value. Such an approach misunderstands the Commission's goal and its role and significance in responding to the abuse and the legacy of harm caused by residential schools. The focus on deliverables and whether the Commission is producing is of concern because of the effect it may have on the Commission's own approach to understanding its work and on the expectations it generates in others for the Commission. The daunting nature of the Commission's role and mandate by any measure, you just have to pick up the document and be grateful you are not a commissioner, may drive the Commission to focus on its responsibilities for certain deliverables under the agreement. And in one sense, this is not only understandable, it's laudable. We want a Commission that takes its role and responsibility seriously, that does something. But in the process, this focus narrows attention to the things the Commission must produce, to what it must do, and away from the reasons for doing it and on the way in which it gets done. As I mentioned, the Commission's pushed back against some of the expectations placed on it, not only about the expectations regarding the production of reconciliation, but they've negotiated the what and the when of some of the deliverables, including the nature and timing of the report and the timing of the national events, along with a number of other issues. But the negotiation always seems to come with some sense of either regret or defended as a necessity, right? Like, we had a false start, nobody could do this, we have to get new offices, we'd really like to be in Manitoba. At the same time, there is overwhelming pressure and a driving focus on production of the report, the research center, national events, and even community events, and very little analysis within the Commission from its supporters or advocates or even its critics of the appropriateness of such a focus. This is not to deny at all that events are important. They are, for sure, they are, but not simply as events. They ought not to command our attention. They ought to command our attention, not for their production value, but for the value of that production. The focus on producing and delivering, I think, threatens to cloud our vision and judgment about what matters most about the Commission. Not what it produces, but how it produces it. A relational approach to understanding the role and the mandate of the Commission suggests instead that the focus should be on the significance of the Commission as a model of the sorts of relationships, institutions, and processes it thinks we need to produce in order to travel that road to reconciliation into the future. That the promise the Commission holds is that it may lay the groundwork for reconciliation, and that groundwork requires truth, not for its own sake, but as foundational to understanding what's needed to address the harms of the past and to forge a different way forward in relationship in the future. But perhaps the most precious and important and valuable contribution the Commission can make to this goal is to hold space open for us all to consider what such relationships require and what they might look like. What's of central importance, then, is how the Commission works, the approach it takes to its own work, the relationships it models, and the values that imbue its work. They're much more important than what it produces at the end of its mandate. The lasting legacy of this Commission, its contribution to reconciliation, will not be its report or its archives or even the memories of its national events. All of these will fade, gather dust, fail to be reprinted, unless the Commission manages to invite us into or model for us a different way forward in relationship with one another. That's what'll keep people reading the report and asking research questions of the archives and telling stories of national gatherings and community commemorations. We need to be compelled that these things matter. And they only matter if, in the end, we still need them on a continuing journey along the road of reconciliation. This metaphor is making me wonder if the tour guide may be right and I may need a car after all. The mandate of the Commission is short, and there's a lot of work before them. But in the bid to get it all done, we cannot let time slip away, because this time represents a unique opportunity to model new ways of interacting with government right, that aren't adversarial, but yet ensure accountability for the commitments they made to support the work of the Commission. The Commission is important for modeling new ways of seeking knowledge and of sharing it, of modeling relationships of respect, concern, and dignity in their dealings with individuals, with groups, communities, and with other institutions, and perhaps most significantly, within the Commission itself. What an incredible legacy the Commission will leave if in its governance, its structure, its policy, its processes, and all its work, it sought to reflect the very relationships it's seeking in reconciliation. Okay, lest you walk away and think I have an unrealistically high expectation of perfection from the Commission, this actually isn't an expectation or a call for their perfect execution of these models, but for them to try and to be mindful and reflective and honest about their successes and their failures. The Commission's success for me will lie in the attempt to do things differently, to operate differently, and to be explicit and honest about their attempts. We could learn more about the work required for reconciliation from the experience of the Commission itself, about the barriers that stood in its way and stand in our way through failures of imagination, patterns and structures and institutional ways of operating that limit our capacity to work in different ways into the future, that make the road ahead towards reconciliation complicated, dangerous, or challenging, so we can navigate those obstacles with our eyes wide open. Self-reflection and transparency from the Commission about itself, about this exercise it's engaged in trying out these new ways of relating, new ways of working, hold the greatest promise for learning about reconciliation. Rather than looking at the Commission then simply as an entity or an institution with responsibility to produce certain deliverables, perhaps we need to widen our view, to see the Commission as a process, as an opportunity to engage us all in that process of figuring out, of practicing what reconciliation might look like and what we will require for our travels together. Thanks.